In early 1944, the Allied armies in Italy had a problem. It was a single mountain, a single ruined monastery, and a defensive line that some of the best generals in the world could not break. For months, American, British, French, and Polish forces had thrown themselves against it. Artillery, tanks, bombers, entire divisions, and every single assault ended the same way. Pinned down, driven back, or buried beneath the rubble of the Italian mountains. The place was called Monte Cassino, and the German army had turned it into one of the most formidable defensive positions in the entire Second World War. From the monastery at the top of the mountain, German paratroopers could see everything, every valley, every road, every Allied movement. It was the keystone of the Gustav Line, a defensive barrier stretching across Italy designed to stop the Allied advance toward Rome. And by the winter of 1944, it was working perfectly, because by that point in the war, something had gone very wrong for the Allied armies. They had landed in Italy with enormous confidence, but now they were stuck, and the German defenses seemed impossible to crack. Entire armies were stalled, and while the biggest Allied divisions were being thrown again and again at the Gustav Line, a smaller unit waited quietly in reserve, a division from a country so small that many Allied officers barely considered it when planning the campaign, a nation of barely 2 million people, halfway across the world, New Zealand. But before we get into the battle that would make the 2nd New Zealand Division one of the most respected formations in the Allied armies. If you enjoy stories about the most unbelievable battles in military history, subscribe to our channel. Because some of the most important victories of World War II were fought by soldiers most people have never heard of, and the Battle for Monte Cassino is one of them. To understand why the New Zealand Division ended up at Monte Cassino, you have to understand the situation the Allies were facing in Italy. Because by early 1944, the war there had become a nightmare. The Italian campaign began with optimism. In September 1943, Allied forces landed in southern Italy after the collapse of Benito Mussolini's regime. Many Allied leaders believed Italy would be the soft underbelly of Hitler's empire. The plan seemed simple: advance north, capture Rome, push the Germans out of Italy. But the German army had other ideas. Under the command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, German forces began turning the mountainous terrain of Italy into a defensive fortress. Instead of defending cities, they defended geography, ridges, river valleys, mountain passes. Every kilometer north became another defensive line, and the most important of those lines was the Gustav Line. At the center of the Gustav Line stood one mountain, and whoever controlled that mountain controlled the entire battlefield. Monte Cassino dominated the Liri Valley. The valley was the main route toward Rome. If Allied forces could push through there, they could break the German defenses and open the road north. But if the Germans held Monte Cassino, every Allied advance would be exposed to observation and artillery fire from above. The mountain overlooked everything, and at its peak stood a structure that had survived for more than 1,000 years, the Abbey of Monte Cassino. The monastery had been founded in the 6th century. It was one of the most famous religious sites in Europe: massive stone walls, thick foundations, and a commanding view over the surrounding countryside. The Germans initially promised not to use the monastery itself for military purposes. But the surrounding slopes, those became a fortress, and the soldiers defending those slopes were among the toughest troops in the German army. They were Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, veterans of battles in Crete, Russia, and North Africa, highly trained, disciplined, and exceptionally skilled in defensive warfare. They dug into the rocky hillsides, camouflaged machine gun nests, mortar positions hidden among shattered stone walls, artillery observers positioned where they could direct fire onto every Allied approach. By early 1944, the slopes around Monte Cassino had become a maze of fortified positions. The Allies launched their attacks regardless. First, the Americans, followed by the British and Indian units. Each assault was backed by heavy artillery bombardments. However, the terrain favored the defenders. Steep slopes, narrow approaches, and limited maneuver space for tanks made progress challenging. Infantry had to climb through mud and rock while under machine gun fire. Progress was measured in meters, sometimes only a few meters per day, and often those gains were lost again within hours. The longer the battle dragged on, the more Monte Cassino became something else, not just a battlefield, but a symbol. For the German army holding the Eiffel, Gustav Line proved that their defensive strategy in Italy was working. For the Allies, each failed assault raised a troubling question. If the combined strength of American, British, and Commonwealth forces could not break the line, what would it take? Because the war in Italy had become a grinding stalemate, and time was not on the Allies' side. The longer the campaign stalled, the longer German divisions could remain tied down there instead of being sent to fight on the Eastern Front or against the coming invasion of France. By early 1944, Allied commanders were searching for new solutions, new strategies, new troops, and increasingly, attention began turning toward units that had already proven themselves in difficult terrain. Units that could fight in the mountains, units that had experience operating under extreme conditions. And one of those units was quietly preparing to enter the battle. Because far from Monte Cassino, a division from a distant Pacific nation had already earned a reputation for fighting in places where other armies struggled. They had fought in Greece, they had fought in North Africa, and now, the war in Italy was about to introduce them to one of the toughest battles of the entire campaign, the 2nd New Zealand Division. And when they entered the fight, Monte Cassino would never be the same again. The soldiers who would eventually fight at Monte Cassino came from a place most Europeans had barely thought about it during the early years of the war: New Zealand, a small island nation in the South Pacific. In 1939, its population was just over 1.6 million people. Yet when the Second World War began, New Zealand mobilized one of the highest percentages of its population of any Allied country. Tens of thousands of men volunteered to fight overseas. And from those men came one of the most respected formations in the Allied armies: the 2nd New Zealand Division. When the division first left New Zealand, few could have predicted the path it would take. Their journey would stretch across half the globe, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Greece to the chaotic evacuation of Crete, and finally to the brutal battlefields of Italy. Along the way, the division developed a reputation that surprised many larger Allied forces. They were adaptable, disciplined, and extremely aggressive in battle. But one man played a crucial role in shaping that reputation, a commander whose personality and experience would define the division for the rest of the war. His name was Bernhard Freyberg. Lieutenant General Bernhard Freyberg was not a typical officer. Born in London but raised in New Zealand, Freyberg had already been a decorated hero during the First World War. He had won the Victoria Cross, the highest award for bravery in the British Empire. And by the time the Second World War began, he was known as a commander who led from the front. Freyberg believed something simple about warfare. If you expected soldiers to endure hardship, their commanders should share it. He frequently visited forward positions. He talked with ordinary soldiers. And he had a habit of pushing his division into difficult missions that other commanders sometimes avoided. This approach earned the division a unique reputation among both allies and enemies. To German forces in North Africa, the New Zealanders became known as the Divine Division. The nickname was partly admiration and partly frustration. Because when New Zealand troops appeared on the battlefield, They had a habit of attacking where the fighting was hardest, and the division proved that reputation repeatedly during the early years of the war. In North Africa, the New Zealand Division fought against the forces of German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The desert campaign was harsh, extreme heat, long supply lines, and constant maneuver warfare across hundreds of miles of open terrain. Yet the New Zealanders consistently performed well in these conditions. At battles like Sidi Rezegh, Minkarkaim, and later El Alamein, the division demonstrated a willingness to fight under intense pressure. Sometimes they fought their way out of encirclement. Sometimes they held positions that seemed impossible to defend. And sometimes they launched sudden counterattacks that surprised even their allies. One characteristic stood out. The New Zealand Division was extremely effective in difficult terrain: mountains, broken ground, narrow valleys. These were places where large mechanized formations struggled to operate. But infantry units trained to move quickly and coordinate closely could still fight effectively. And the New Zealanders became particularly skilled at exactly that kind of warfare, which is exactly why, when the fighting moved to Italy, Allied commanders began looking for divisions capable of something very specific: breaking deadlocks. After the Allied victory in North Africa in 1943, many divisions were redeployed to the Italian campaign. Among them was the 2nd New Zealand Division. At first, their role in Italy was relatively routine, advancing north, supporting larger Allied operations. But as the campaign progressed and the fighting grew more difficult, their role began to change. Because the terrain of Italy was unlike anything many Allied armies had faced before. Italy is a country dominated by mountains. The Apennine Range runs down the center of the peninsula like a spine. Every river valley becomes a defensive line. Every hilltop becomes an observation post. Every narrow road becomes a potential choke point. And German commanders understood this terrain perfectly. They used it to build layer after layer of defensive positions, which meant that advancing north required something more than numbers. It required divisions that could fight effectively in mountains, divisions capable of coordinating infantry, artillery, and armor under extremely difficult conditions. And by early 1944, the YAO Allies had a major problem that needed exactly that kind of division. Monte Cassino had stopped multiple Allied assaults. American troops had tried. British units had tried. Indian divisions had tried. And despite massive bombardments and repeated attacks, the Gustav Line remained intact. The German paratroopers defending the mountain simply refused to break. Every assault ended with the same result: heavy casualties, minimal progress. The front barely moved. So Allied commanders began reconsidering their options. What they needed was a formation capable of operating in difficult terrain, a division that had already proven it could attack in complex environments, and one that had experience working closely with armored units. Because at Monte Cassino, the battlefield demanded all three, which is how the soldiers from a distant Pacific nation found themselves assigned one of the most difficult missions of the entire Italian campaign: breaking the line at Monte Cassino, a task that had already defeated some of the largest armies in the world. And the URI next phase of the battle would test the New Zealand Division more severely than anything they had faced before. By the winter of 1944, Monte Cassino had become one of the most heavily defended positions in the entire European war. But the fortress that stopped the Allied armies was not just the monastery itself. It was the mountain and the terrain surrounding it. Because the German defense of the Gustav Line was built around something simple: geography. The Gustav Line extended across central Italy, stretching from coast to coast. It followed the natural contours of the land, including rivers, mountain ridges, and narrow valleys, and every obstacle that could impede an advancing army. However, the most critical sector of this line was the Liri Valley, which served as the main highway leading directly to Rome. Any army moving north through Italy would inevitably have to pass through this valley. Towering above the entrance to the Liri Valley was the imposing Monte Cassino. Whoever controlled that mountain controlled the entire battlefield. From the slopes of Monte Cassino, German observers had a clear view for miles. They could watch every Allied movement, every convoy, every artillery position, and every troop advance. Once they spotted something, they were able to destroy it. German artillery was strategically positioned throughout the surrounding hills, with observers on the mountain directing the fire. The result was devastating. Any Allied unit attempting to move through the valley quickly came under precise bombardment, which meant the only real way forward was directly into the mountains. And that is exactly where the Germans wanted the fight to happen. The troops defending the area were among the best soldiers available to the German army. They were Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, elite infantry trained for both airborne operations and defensive combat. Many had already fought in brutal battles across Europe, Crete, Russia, North Africa. By the time they arrived at Monte Cassino, they were experienced and highly disciplined, and they knew how to build defensive positions that could survive almost anything, because the German defenses around Monte Cassino were not simple trenches. They were layered systems built for endurance. Machine gun positions were dug into rock. Mortar pits were hidden behind stone terraces. Snipers occupied ruined farmhouses scattered across the slopes. Even narrow goat paths had been covered by defensive fire. Every approach to the mountain was observed. Every path was defended. Every ridge concealed another position waiting to fire. The terrain itself multiplied the strength of the defenders. An attacking army could not advance in large formations. Instead, units had to climb narrow slopes in small groups, which meant they could be targeted easily. And the weather made everything worse. Winter rain turned the ground into mud. Rivers overflowed. Roads collapsed into deep ruts. Heavy vehicles struggled to move at all. Even supplying the front line became difficult. Men often carried ammunition and equipment by hand across steep hillsides. Yet despite these obstacles, the Allies attacked anyway, and the first attempts to break the line ended badly. In January 1944, American forces launched their first major assault on Monte Cassino. Their objective was straightforward: cross the Rapido River, push through the German defenses, and open the road to Rome. However, the Rapido was heavily fortified. German machine guns covered every possible crossing point, and artillery had been pre-registered on likely attack routes. When American troops attempted to cross the river, they were met with devastating fire. Many units suffered severe casualties before they even reached the far bank, and some never made it across at all. Despite the losses, Allied commanders continued the offensive. Indian and British units attacked the mountain slopes from different directions. Their task was even more difficult. They had to climb steep ridges under constant machine gun fire. Sometimes the fighting took place at extremely close range: grenades, rifles, bayonets. But even when Allied troops captured parts of the mountain, they struggled to hold them. German counterattacks were swift and coordinated. Positions changed hands repeatedly. And slowly, the realization spread among Allied commanders. Breaking the Gustav Line would require something more than sheer numbers, because Monte Cassino had become something else entirely. Not just a defensive position, but a battlefield that demanded a very specific kind of soldier. Soldiers needed to operate in mountains. They needed to coordinate closely with artillery. They needed to move quickly through broken terrain. And above all, they needed the endurance to fight under conditions that seemed almost impossible, which meant Allied commanders began searching for units that had already proven they could operate under those conditions. Units that had fought in difficult terrain before. Units capable of adapting quickly. And once again, one division kept appearing in those discussions: the 2nd New Zealand Division. By early 1944, the New Zealanders had already built a reputation for reliability in difficult operations. They were not the largest division in the Allied army. but they had repeatedly demonstrated the ability to operate effectively under pressure, and their commander, Bernhard Freyberg, was known for taking on challenging missions, which meant that when the next phase of the Battle for Monte Cassino began, the New Zealand Division would be placed at the center of it. But before the New Zealanders entered the battle, one of the most controversial decisions of the entire Italian campaign was about to take place, a decision involving the ancient monastery at the top of the mountain, a decision that would change the battlefield forever. Because within days, Monte Cassino itself would be reduced to rubble, and the war on that mountain was about to become even more brutal. For more than 1,000 years, the monastery of Monte Cassino had stood on its mountain overlooking the Italian countryside. Founded in the year 529 A.D. by Saint Benedict, the abbey was one of the most important religious sites in Europe. Its walls had survived centuries of war, invasion, and political turmoil. Generations of monks had lived there in quiet isolation, preserving manuscripts and religious traditions that stretched back to the early Middle Ages. But by early 1944, this ancient monastery had become something else, the focal point of a modern battlefield. From below, the abbey appeared to dominate everything. Its massive stone walls towered over the surrounding slopes. To many Allied soldiers looking up from the valley, it seemed obvious that German forces must be using the monastery as an observation post, because whoever controlled that height could see the entire battlefield. Every Allied movement in the valley below would be visible, and if German observers were inside the abbey, they could direct artillery fire with devastating accuracy. But there was a problem. No one could prove that the Germans were actually inside the monastery. German commanders had initially declared the abbey a neutral zone. They promised not to station troops inside the building itself. Instead, their forces occupied the slopes around it, machine gun nests, mortar positions, observation posts hidden among the rocky hillsides. Technically, the abbey itself remained empty of soldiers, but the surrounding terrain was filled with them, and from the perspective of Allied troops fighting below, that distinction hardly mattered. Artillery shells continued falling with alarming precision. Convoys moving along the valley roads were quickly targeted. Troops advancing toward the mountain were repeatedly pinned down. Many Allied commanders became convinced that German observers must be inside the monastery. Whether that belief was correct or not, it began to shape their decisions. And eventually, those decisions led to one of the most controversial actions of the entire war. In February 1944, Allied commanders approved a massive bombing raid. Their objective was simple: destroy the monastery. If German observers were inside it, they would be eliminated, and the defenders would lose the high ground that dominated the battlefield. The plan called for hundreds of heavy bombers to strike the ancient building. It would be one of the largest air attacks ever directed against a single-point target during the Italian campaign. On February 15, 1944, the operation began. Allied bombers appeared in the skies above Monte Cassino. Wave after wave of aircraft approached the mountain. American B-17S, B-25S, B-26S. Hundreds of tons of explosives were about to fall on the monastery. When the bombs struck, the destruction was immense. The ancient building shattered under the explosions. Stone walls that had stood for centuries collapsed within minutes. Massive clouds of dust rose into the sky. By the time the bombing ended, the monastery was no longer a monastery. It was a field of rubble. But something unexpected happened, something that would shape the rest of the battle. Before the bombing, German troops had mostly avoided the interior of the monastery. After the bombing, they moved in. The ruins created the perfect defensive position: broken stone walls, collapsed buildings, cratered ground. All of it provided excellent cover for experienced infantry. German Fallschirmjäger quickly occupied the wreckage. and they turned the ruins of the Abbey into one of the strongest defensive positions on the mountain. Ironically, the bombing had not eliminated the German advantage. It had strengthened it. From the Allied perspective, the situation remained difficult. The monastery was gone, but the German defenses around the mountain were still intact, and now the ruins themselves had become a fortress, which meant the Battle for Monte Cassino was far from over. In fact, it was about to become even more brutal, because the next Allied assault would involve a new force entering the battlefield, a division that had already built a reputation for tackling difficult missions. And now they were about to be tasked with attacking one of the most dangerous positions in Italy. The 2nd New Zealand Division had arrived. Their objective would not be the monastery itself, not yet. Instead, they would attack the town of Cassino at the base of the mountain, a maze of ruined buildings and narrow streets, a place where tanks struggled to maneuver and infantry fought at extremely close range, and the success of the entire Allied offensive might depend on what happened there. Because when the New Zealand Division entered the battle for Cassino, they were stepping into one of the most destructive urban battlefields of the entire Italian campaign, and the fighting that followed would test them more severely than anything they had faced before. When the New Zealand Division arrived near Monte Cassino in early 1944, the battlefield they entered looked nothing like the quiet Italian countryside that had existed there only months earlier. Cassino town had been almost completely destroyed. Weeks of artillery bombardments and air attacks had reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Streets that once carried farmers and merchants were now filled with shattered stone, burned vehicles, and collapsed buildings. The town had become a maze, a perfect environment for defensive warfare. And the defenders were ready. German Fallschirmjäger units had turned the wreckage into a network of strongpoints. Machine guns were hidden inside broken walls. Snipers watched from the upper floors of ruined houses. Mortar teams operated from concealed positions behind piles of stone. To attacking troops, every pile of rubble could hide a weapon. Every alley could become an ambush. And the soldiers advancing into that maze were about to discover something important. Cassino was not a battle of movement, it was a battle of meters. The assault on Cassino town was carried out primarily by units of the 2nd New Zealand Division, supported by armor from the New Zealand Armored Brigade and other Allied formations. The plan seemed straightforward on paper. New Zealand infantry would advance through the ruined town. Armored units would support them where possible. Once Cassino was secured, Allied forces could move up the mountain toward the monastery and finally break the Gustav Line. But the reality on the ground was far more complicated. Tanks were supposed to provide heavy firepower during the assault. However, the narrow streets of Cassino were filled with debris. Collapsed buildings blocked key routes. Bridges had been destroyed, and hidden German anti-tank weapons waited at choke points. This meant armored units often struggled to move forward. Without tanks leading the way, infantry had to advance carefully on foot. Every step required caution. Every doorway had to be checked. And once the fighting began inside the town, the battle turned into something even more dangerous. Close quarters combat. In Cassino, much of the fighting happened at extremely short distances. Sometimes soldiers were separated by only a few meters. Gunfire echoed through shattered streets. Grenades were thrown into rooms before troops entered. Walls were blasted open to avoid exposed doorways. Each building became a small battlefield, and progress was painfully slow. German Fallschirmjäger defenders fought with remarkable determination. They knew the terrain, they understood the defensive advantages of the ruins, and they were highly skilled infantry. Machine gun teams covered key intersections. Snipers targeted officers and radio operators. Mortars were fired from hidden positions further up the slopes. The defenders used every advantage available, and for the New Zealand soldiers advancing through the town, the battlefield became increasingly chaotic. Smoke from explosions filled the air. Visibility dropped. Radio communication became unreliable as units moved deeper into the rubble. Sometimes small groups of soldiers lost contact with neighboring units. In these moments, initiative became critical. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers often made quick decisions on the spot. Clear this building, secure that street, move forward, or fall back. Despite the difficulties, the New Zealand Division continued pushing forward. Where tanks could move, they provided valuable fire support. High explosive shells blasted enemy positions hidden inside buildings. Infantry followed behind, clearing the damaged structures. But each advance triggered German counterfire, machine guns, mortars, snipers. The defenders responded immediately to any Allied movement, and as the battle intensified, one harsh truth became clear. Cassino town itself was not the final objective. It was only the beginning. Even if the New Zealand Division captured the entire town, the German defenders still held the high ground above. The slopes leading toward the monastery remained heavily fortified, and the Fallschirmjäger watching from above could still direct artillery onto the battlefield below, which meant that every street captured in Cassino came at a cost. Casualties mounted. The rubble made evacuation of wounded soldiers difficult. Stretcher bearers struggled through broken streets under fire. Medical teams worked in makeshift aid stations among the ruins. Yet, despite the hardship, the New Zealand troops continued fighting. Their training and experience in difficult terrain allowed them to adapt quickly. They worked closely with supporting units. Engineers cleared obstacles. Artillery adjusted fire support as troops advanced. Step by step, the attackers attempted to push deeper into the town. But the battle for Cassino was about to become even more complicated, because the Germans were not finished, not even close. As Allied troops advanced into the ruins, German commanders reinforced their defensive lines. Additional Fallschirmjäger units moved into position. Counterattacks were prepared. The defenders knew that if Cassino fell completely, the road toward the monastery would open, and they were determined to prevent that at any cost. The battle for Cassino town was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous phase was still ahead, because as the New Zealand Division continued its assault, the Germans prepared a series of fierce counterattacks that would turn the ruined town into one of the most intense urban battlefields of the entire Italian campaign. And in the next phase of the fight, the New Zealand soldiers would discover just how difficult breaking the Monte Cassino line would truly be. By the time the New Zealand Division pushed into the ruins of Cassino town, the battle had already become one of the most destructive engagements of the Italian campaign. Entire streets were gone. Buildings had collapsed into piles of stone. Smoke drifted through the shattered town day and night. But the German defenders were far from defeated. In fact, for them, the battle was entering its most important phase. Because the Fallschirmjäger defending Monte Cassino understood something crucial about the battlefield. They did not need to win quickly. They only needed to hold. The German paratroopers were experts in defensive warfare. Years of fighting had taught them how to turn ruined terrain into an advantage. Every collapsed wall could become a firing position. Every crater could hide a machine gun. Every broken street could be covered by crossfire. And most importantly, the defenders knew the terrain far better than the attacking forces. They had studied the approaches, mapped the buildings, marked the streets where Allied armor would struggle to move. When the New Zealand Division entered the town, they were walking into a battlefield that had already been carefully prepared. And as night fell over Cassino, the German defenders began their counterattack. Night fighting in Cassino was especially dangerous. The ruined buildings created deep shadows. Visibility dropped dramatically once the sun went down, and the maze of broken streets made navigation difficult even during daylight. Under these conditions, small groups of German soldiers began moving through the rubble, sometimes only a handful at a time. Their objective was simple: disrupt the Allied advance, harass the attackers, and if possible, push them back. German patrols slipped through narrow alleyways. They approached Allied positions quietly. Then suddenly the silence would break. Grenades thrown through shattered windows, short bursts of automatic fire. Quick attacks meant to force the attackers to pull back or reposition. Then the German soldiers would disappear again into the darkness. These tactics created constant pressure. Allied troops could never be certain where the next attack would come from. And the longer the battle continued, the more difficult it became for the attackers to maintain momentum. Urban combat is already complex, but Cassino made it even worse. The destruction caused by bombardments had altered the entire layout of the town. Maps became unreliable. Landmarks disappeared. Units advancing through rubble sometimes found themselves unexpectedly exposed to enemy fire. Even experienced soldiers struggled to maintain orientation in the shattered environment. Armored support remained limited. Some tanks managed to enter parts of the town, providing valuable firepower. But the terrain constantly restricted their movement. Collapsed buildings blocked streets. German anti-tank weapons were hidden among the ruins. One well-placed shot could disable a vehicle and block an entire route forward, which meant infantry often had to continue advancing without heavy support. And while the New Zealand Division pushed forward inside the town, the most dangerous threat still came from above. German artillery positioned on surrounding ridges continued firing into Cassino. Observers watching from higher ground could see movement inside the town. Whenever Allied forces attempted to concentrate troops or vehicles, artillery shells quickly followed. Explosions echoed through the narrow streets. Dust and smoke filled the air, and the rubble that already made movement difficult became even more unstable. For soldiers on the ground, the battlefield never truly felt secure. Even captured positions remained vulnerable to artillery. Casualties continued to rise. Medical teams worked under extremely difficult conditions. Wounded soldiers had to be carried through broken streets to reach aid stations. Sometimes stretcher bearers moved under fire. Sometimes they navigated through collapsed buildings and narrow gaps between debris. Every evacuation required careful coordination, and every delay increased the danger for the injured. Yet despite these challenges, the New Zealand Division continued fighting, because pulling back would have meant surrendering hard-won ground. The soldiers of the 2nd New Zealand Division had already fought in difficult campaigns before arriving in Italy. They understood that some battles could not be decided quickly. Cassino was one of those battles. Instead of dramatic breakthroughs, progress came slowly. A street is secured, a building cleared, a defensive position captured. Each small advance pushed the line forward only slightly. But over time, those small advances added up. However, German commanders were equally determined. They reinforced their positions around Cassino. Additional Fallschirmjäger units moved into the area. Supplies and ammunition were brought forward despite Allied artillery. The defenders knew that the longer they held Monte Cassino, the longer the entire Allied advance through Italy would remain stalled. And so they fought with relentless discipline. Which meant that by the end of the fighting in Cassino town, both sides had reached a grim realization. Capturing the town alone would not break the Gustav Line. The real key to the battlefield still lay above, on the slopes leading toward the monastery, and those slopes were defended by some of the most determined soldiers in the German army. The New Zealand Division had fought its way into Cassino, but the battle for the town was only one part of the struggle. The true challenge still remained. Climbing the mountain, breaking the German defenses above, and finally forcing open the road toward Rome. And the next phase of the battle would prove even more dangerous than anything the soldiers had faced inside the ruined city. By the time the fighting inside Cassino town slowed, the soldiers of the 2nd New Zealand, the division understood something clearly. The ruined town itself was not the key to victory. It was only the gateway. The true objective still loomed above them: Monte Cassino. From the valley floor, the mountain seemed almost vertical. Steep ridges climbed toward the summit. Rocky terraces cut across the slopes. Narrow footpaths twisted upward between stone walls and broken vegetation, and above everything, the shattered remains of the monastery watched over the battlefield. To break the Gustav Line, Allied forces needed to climb those slopes, and that meant attacking uphill against defenders who could see every movement. In mountain warfare, the advantage almost always belongs to the defender. German paratroopers had spent weeks strengthening their positions around the mountain. They used the terrain carefully. Machine guns were placed where they could sweep entire approaches. Mortars were hidden behind rocky outcrops. Snipers occupied vantage points overlooking the town below. Even the narrow goat paths climbing toward the monastery had been mapped and covered by defensive fire. For the attackers, there were very few routes upward, and each of those routes was dangerous. Despite these obstacles, Allied commanders ordered new assaults. Units of the New Zealand Division were tasked with pushing toward key positions on the slopes. The goal was to gradually secure the high ground. Once the slopes were captured, Allied forces could isolate the German defenders in the monastery ruins. But moving uphill under enemy observation was extremely difficult. Every advance was exposed, and once the attacks began, the mountain itself became the enemy. Infantry units advanced slowly, often in small groups. They had to carry heavy equipment by hand, including ammunition, mortar rounds, radio batteries, and even water supplies. Vehicles could rarely reach the upper slopes, which forced soldiers to transport everything they needed on their backs. As they climbed, they came under fire from German machine guns. Bullets hit the rock, shattering the stone. Mortar shells detonated among the terraces. At times, the attackers had to crawl forward between boulders, while at other times they moved only at night to avoid being seen. Even getting to the starting point for an assault could take hours. Every upward step required patience and discipline. But the German defenders were not simply waiting. They were watching. Observation posts higher on the mountain directed artillery fire toward the slopes. Whenever Allied units gathered in one location, shells quickly followed. Explosions echoed through the valleys. Dust and smoke rolled across the mountainside, and the terrain that made defense so strong made retreat equally dangerous. Once troops moved, onto the slopes, pulling back under fire was often just as difficult as advancing. To overcome these challenges, Allied commanders attempted to coordinate multiple attacks across different sectors. Infantry would advance, artillery would suppress known German positions. Tanks and armored vehicles in the valley would fire high explosive shells into enemy strong points. But even with careful planning, the terrain limited what could be achieved. Communication lines frequently broke down, radio signals were unreliable in the mountains, and individual units often found themselves fighting isolated battles against well-hidden defenders. And slowly, the reality of the battlefield began to sink in. Breaking Monte Cassino would not be quick. The soldiers of the New Zealand Division pushed forward whenever possible, but progress remained painfully slow. A ridge captured one day might be contested again the next. Small advances required enormous effort. Every position gained came at a cost, and the German paratroopers defending the slopes continued to fight with remarkable determination. For the defenders, the strategy remained simple. Hold the mountain, delay the Allied advance, force the attackers to fight for every meter. As long as Monte Cassino remained in German hands, the Gustav Line would continue to block the road toward Rome, and the longer the line held, the longer Germany could slow the Allied campaign in Italy, which meant the battle had reached a turning point. By early 1944, it was clear that repeated assaults alone might not be enough to break the line. New tactics would be required, more coordination, more pressure across multiple sectors. The battle for Monte Cassino would become part of a larger Allied effort to finally push through the Gustav Line, and that effort would soon involve forces from several different nations fighting together. Because the struggle for Monte Cassino was no longer just one division attacking a mountain, it had become one of the most complex Allied operations of the entire Italian campaign. And in the next phase of the battle, new forces would enter the fight. For the New Zealand Division and their allies, the hardest fighting was still ahead. When the guns finally fell silent around Monte Cassino in May 1944, the battlefield looked almost unrecognizable. The mountain slopes were scarred with craters. Entire villages had disappeared beneath rubble. Cassino town itself had been reduced to little more than broken stone and twisted steel. And the ancient monastery that had stood for centuries had become a shattered ruin. The battle for Monte Cassino had lasted months, and it had cost thousands of lives. But the capture of the mountain did something far more important than simply destroy a fortress. It broke the Gustav Line. With the German defensive line collapsing, Allied forces finally pushed through the Liri Valley. Armored units advanced along the roads that had been blocked for so long. Infantry divisions moved north through the hills. For the first time in months, the front line in Italy began moving again. The road toward Rome was open, and within weeks Allied forces would enter the city. The battle for Monte Cassino had become one of the most important turning points of the Italian campaign. But it had also revealed something about the soldiers who fought there. Because the divisions that endured the hardest fighting on the mountain had earned lasting reputations among both allies and enemies. And among those units, the 2nd New Zealand Division stood out. By the time the fighting ended, the reputation of the New Zealand soldiers had spread throughout the Allied armies. The New Zealand Division had fought in several of the most difficult operations during the war. They had faced German forces in Greece. They had fought through the desert battles of North Africa. They had survived encirclements and counterattacks. And now they had fought through one of the most brutal battles of the Italian campaign. Their ability to operate under pressure had become widely recognized. Their commander, Bernhard Freyberg, remained a central figure in the division's identity. Freyberg was known for trusting his soldiers and encouraging initiative. Officers were expected to lead from the front. Junior leaders were expected to make decisions when communication broke down. And soldiers were expected to adapt to difficult conditions. This style of leadership helped the division remain effective even during chaotic fighting. And over time, the New Zealand Division developed a reputation that few formations achieved during the war. Among Allied troops, the New Zealanders were known as reliable soldiers, units that could be trusted, with difficult assignments, units that could adapt to unfamiliar terrain, units that would continue fighting even when conditions became extremely difficult. But the respect extended beyond their own allies. German soldiers who fought against the New Zealand Division often acknowledged their effectiveness. The nickname Divine Division continued circulating among German units that encountered them. It was partly admiration and partly recognition that the New Zealanders were consistently placed in some of the most demanding sectors of the front. After Monte Cassino, the New Zealand Division continued participating in the Italian campaign. The war did not end immediately. German forces withdrew northward, establishing new defensive positions along the Apennine Mountains. But the momentum had changed. The Allies were advancing, and the soldiers who had fought through Cassino carried valuable experience into the next phase of the campaign. Yet for many soldiers, the memory of Monte Cassino remained the defining experience of the war in Italy. Few battles have been fought under such difficult conditions: mountain warfare, urban combat, heavy artillery, and months of relentless pressure on both sides. The fighting tested every unit that participated, and it had demonstrated just how difficult breaking a determined defensive line could be. For the soldiers of the New Zealand Division, Cassino was not just another engagement. It was a battle that would be remembered long after the war ended. Today, the slopes around Monte Cassino are peaceful once more. The monastery has been rebuilt, and fields and roads cover the valleys below. However, the cemeteries surrounding the mountain serve as a solemn reminder of the battle's cost. Thousands of soldiers from various nations are buried there: British, American, Polish, French, Indian, and New Zealand. Today, the slopes around Monte Cassino are peaceful once more. The monastery has been rebuilt, and fields and roads cover the valleys below. However, the cemeteries surrounding the mountain serve as a solemn reminder of the battle's cost. Thousands of soldiers from various nations are buried there: British, American, Polish, French, Indian, and New Zealand. Each headstone represents a life caught in the struggle for a single mountain. And when historians look back at the battle today, they often see Monte Cassino as more than just a military victory. They see it as a moment that proved something important about the Allied armies, because even small nations could play decisive roles in the outcome of the war, and few divisions demonstrated that better than the soldiers who had come from the far side of the world. The 2nd New Zealand Division. Today, Monte Cassino stands once again on its mountain. The monastery has been rebuilt, stone by stone, its walls restored, its courtyards quiet again. Visitors walk the same paths where soldiers once fought among rubble and fire. From the terrace of the Abbey, the view stretches across the Leary Valley just as it did during the war. Green fields, narrow roads, distant hills. It is peaceful now, but in 1944 that same view looked very different, because from this mountain an entire campaign had once been stopped. The battle for Monte Cassino had lasted for months. 4 major Allied offensives, thousands of artillery shells, hundreds of aircraft, and countless infantry assaults. The Gustav Line had become one of the most formidable defensive barriers of the war in Europe. Breaking it required determination from armies across the Allied coalition: British, American, French, Polish, Indian, and New Zealand. Each nation contributed soldiers to the battle. Each paid a price, but among those forces, some units became especially associated with the struggle. And one of them came from a country many people in Europe had barely considered before the war: New Zealand. The soldiers of the 2nd New Zealand Division had traveled further than almost any other Allied troops, from the Pacific Islands of their homeland to the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Italy. Along the way, they had faced some of the most experienced forces in the German army. They had fought in Greece. They had endured the chaos of Crete. They had battled Rommel's forces across the deserts of Libya and Egypt. And finally, they had fought through the ruins of Cassino. For a nation so small, their contribution to the war had been enormous. During the Second World War, New Zealand committed a significant portion of its population to the Allied war effort. Thousands of soldiers served overseas. Many never returned home. Those who fought in Italy faced some of the most difficult conditions of the European war: mountain terrain, urban destruction, constant artillery fire. Yet, despite the challenges, the division maintained its reputation as one of the most dependable formations in the Allied armies. Their commander, Bernhard Freiberg, often reflected the character of the division itself: direct, determined, and deeply connected to the soldiers under his command. Freiberg's leadership emphasized adaptability and initiative, qualities that proved essential in the unpredictable terrain of Italy. Under his command, the New Zealand Division became known as a formation capable of operating effectively in almost any environment. And that reputation had not gone unnoticed by the enemy. German soldiers who fought against the New Zealand Division often recognized their persistence. The nickname Divine Division circulated among some German units. Part admiration, part frustration. Because the New Zealanders had developed a habit of appearing in some of the most difficult sectors of the battlefield. Wherever the terrain was harsh, wherever the fighting was most intense, the New Zealand Division often found itself involved. Monte Cassino was one of those places. When the Gustav Line finally collapsed, the Allied advance Through Italy resumed. Rome fell in June 1944. German forces withdrew further north, and the long campaign across the Italian peninsula continued. But Monte Cassino remained one of the defining battles of that campaign, not because it was the largest battle or the fastest, but because it demonstrated something important about modern warfare. Victory in difficult terrain is rarely dramatic. It is usually slow, painful, and relentless. The battle for Monte Cassino was not decided in a single moment. There was no sudden breakthrough that ended the fighting instantly. Instead, the battle unfolded through months of effort. Infantry climbing steep slopes, engineers clearing rubble, artillery crews firing thousands of shells, and soldiers advancing meter by meter through ruined streets and rocky hillsides. In that kind of battle, endurance becomes as important as strategy, and the soldiers who succeed are often the ones who refuse to give up when progress seems impossible. Today, memorials and cemeteries surround Monte Cassino. Rows of white headstones stretch across carefully maintained grounds. Each one represents a soldier who fought in the struggle for the mountain. The names come from many different countries, different languages, different backgrounds, but they share a common story. They fought for the same objective, breaking the line that blocked the Allied advance. At the beginning of the Italian campaign, the Allies believed the road to Rome would be easy. But Monte Cassino proved otherwise. The mountains stopped entire armies. It resisted repeated assaults. And for months it seemed almost impossible to break. Yet eventually, the line collapsed. Not because of one army, not because of one nation, but because soldiers from across the Allied world refused to stop fighting. Among them were the quiet soldiers from a distant Pacific country, men who had traveled across half the world to fight on a mountain in Italy. And when the battle for Monte Cassino finally ended, their reputation had only grown stronger, because the small division that many once overlooked had helped break one of the strongest defensive lines of the war. And on that mountain, the 2nd New Zealand Division proved exactly why the Germans called them the Divine Division.